I want to welcome everyone here and thank you for joining us. Before beginning the session today, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and I think you're going to benefit from their experience and expertise as we look at the issue facing us all today. I'm not going to read through their whole bios. I think if you joined the session, you will have seen them, but I just want to highlight that Milla Craig is the founder and president of Millennial Inc., and that's an independent advisory firm helping investors integrate ESG issues into their investment decisions. It helps companies communicate their material ESG issues to investors, and it helps boards of directors understand their ESG responsibilities. Now, she's worked closely with senior managements and boards from publicly listed companies, as well as financial analysts and investment managers of several Canadian pension and investment funds. She's also a board member of the Responsible Investment Association of Canada and sits on their nomination committee. So welcome, Milla. Melissa Sonberg has over 3 decades of international leadership success across a broad range of corporate, not-for-profit, and academic environments. She's a seasoned C-suite executive and currently sits on several boards. And in addition to her role as a director on the boards of Hydro One, Exchange Income Corporation, and Athenian, Melissa is a professor of practice in the OB area at McGill University. So that's brief, but I think we want to get on to what we're all here for. And as we know, the board has many roles, but a key role is to plan for the future by putting in place a strategy that will allow the company to meet its objectives and fulfill its mission to shareholders and to stakeholders. As any company envisions its future, it must consider ESG issues. Today, we're just going to focus on one element, and that's climate change and the role it should be playing within your corporate strategy, and a role and something that your board should be very focused on today. I'm going to now turn it over to Milla, who will open and give an overview of where GHG climate sits within the ESG context. We'll have a few set questions to allow Milla and Melissa to further expand on their areas of expertise and maybe share some of their experience. And then we'll open it up to you, and you can note your questions in the chat, or at one point, we'll open it up for you to also ask your questions in person. So upon that, I'm going to turn it over to Milla.
Thank you very much, Dora. Let me just, I'll share my screen with us. Okay. So perhaps you can tell me if you can see that well. That's good. Perfect. All right. So good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you this afternoon and to be able to talk about climate change and the transition to a lower carbon economy. I see that this is up here. I'll begin by providing a bit of a brief overview of the ESG landscape and discussing why it's taking such importance in the financial markets, in an effort to help you understand the growing needs of investors, such that we can set the stage for our discussion from my focus area, which is the financial market stakeholders. So I'd like to begin by addressing, let's see here, sorry, why is this not? One moment. For some reason, my slides are not switching for me. Here we go. So I'd like to begin by addressing a key point, which is that ESG does not equal GHG, or climate change. The term ESG encompasses a broad array of topics, ranging from environmental to social to governance issues, with an aim to address the financial materiality of these issues to a business. And so the next question is, well, what are these issues? So they're topics that most companies are already managing to some degree. There are things like on the E front, you'll see we have energy efficiency, waste management, water usage. Because to not manage these issues, if they're relevant for your business, means that you're not being an efficient business or you're leaving money on the table. On the S front, we speak about the ability to attract and retain the most competent employees. What business doesn't want the best talent? And it's about diversity of your employee base, another topic which we could do a whole other session on. And it's also about the social acceptability of your business, and a topic that all businesses have to worry about these days, which is customer data privacy. So all large topics, as you can see. And then we get to the G. And this is where we speak about things like cybersecurity and compensation, executive compensation, and culture. Again, big topics. But you may be surprised to see, but this is also where we put climate change. Why? Because as Dora mentioned, it's a systemic issue that will impact everyone. In fact, the financial markets are so concerned about it because they realize that there is no way to diversify away from climate change to protect our pensions and the assets of people. The only way is to invest through this pending risk. So given its size and the inability to diversify, it's a risk that needs to be managed. And therefore, it is expected to be considered by every board of directors. But before I go there, let's talk about why we're here from a financial markets perspective. So central banks globally are realizing that they need to help manage this issue, as their role is to ensure the stability of the whole financial system. For the past number of years, the risk of the pandemic was on the radar of the World Economic Forum's top risks. So it was known that we might have an issue like COVID, but it was considered unlikely. As we all know, 2020 was a big year. So the financial markets saw the impacts of COVID taking hold, and it realized that from a risk management standpoint, that there is another pending risk that the scientific research is telling them is also highly probable, which is climate change. And therefore the markets are really now beginning to take this very seriously. So pension funds, insurance companies, asset owners, individuals alike, they've decided that it's time now to take climate risk seriously, and that there is a risk to the stability of our global financial system if we don't. So during COVID, ESG funds like what you see here on the screen have performed very well versus their traditional peers. And the market performance during this time has proven that those who manage ESG issues well minimize their risk and in many cases, outperform their peers. And this has caused the investment industry to realize that it is in their fiduciary duty to invest with ESG topics in mind. So this chart is a representation of what's been happening across the investment industry, a major acceleration of money moving into ESG-oriented funds. You can see the flows here into the US, huge in 2020. And actually earlier this month, we saw BlackRock launch a new US carbon transition readiness exchange-traded fund. In its first day of trading, it had inflows of money of $1.25 billion, a record in the 30 years that ETFs have been in the market. I mention this because what you see is that there is a lot of these funds going into passive investments or exchange-traded funds. And some estimates have that this ETF market could grow to close to 40% of all capital markets. So they will continue to be a major influencer. But behind these funds are rating agencies. And increasingly, they are looking at ESG issues. At the last count, there were over 600 rating agencies actively assessing ESG issues of a company. Many of these firms have been bought out by credit rating agencies over the last year or two, meaning that ESG issues are now part of your corporate credit rating as well. And they're now clearly impacting an organization's ability to either access capital or the price that you will pay for that capital. And from my perspective, climate change is currently the issue that the financial markets are trying to assess to value the business appropriately. And that has and will change as other topics will arrive depending on the dynamics of the market as well. So just a point that this is just where we are today. I'm not going to hit all of these, but I did want to just highlight that regulations are supporting this investors movement globally and locally as well. I'll just hit a couple here on this slide. One is this framework where the investors are, this UN Principles of Responsible Investing. They've made it mandatory for their signatories to report to the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures Framework, or the TCFD. You'll hear me talk more about that. New Zealand has also been the first country to make it mandatory for this alignment by both their financial institutions and listed companies. The UK is doing similar, excuse me, and we expect to see similar sorts of movement south of the border, with the SEC moving very, very quickly on this front. And in Canada, we are seeing many movements, many unknown if you're not in this field and paying attention. Some of the most recent was that we had the Sustainable Finance Action Council, which has been mandated to implement the recommendations of Canada's expert panel on sustainable finance, which includes making the TCFD framework mandatory. We've had the Ontario Capital Markets Modernization Task Force, whose final recommendations includes making this TCFD framework mandatory by Canadian companies. Just before Christmas, we had the Maple 8, or the large 8 Canadian pension funds, issue a joint statement for the first time ever, calling for TCFD and SASB. It's another framework, I'll speak about it in a few minutes, a SASB-aligned disclosures by our companies. And yesterday we had the federal budget announce that Canadian Crown corporations will be required to report to the TCFD and gender diversity targets by 2022 or 2024, depending on the size of the organization. So there may be some hard regulations, but even without hard regulations, the market is definitely moving with respect to this. And so the question becomes, why? Well, in order for financial stakeholders to be able to assess the risks or opportunities related to climate change or other issues, they need decision-useful, comparable data. So how do you get this? Well, these two frameworks that I've mentioned, the SASB and the TCFD, are the two that the investor community is really using and desiring for corporates to use. So in 2020, we at Milla did a survey of Canadian institutional investors. And one of the points that we were assessing was which of these reporting frameworks are they using, or which companies to use. And what you see here is that 81% of the investors are either using or guiding to SASB as an assessment process. And 75% are looking to or already aligning to the TCFD. However, we also look at disclosures of Canadian listed companies, and only 49% of Canadian listed companies are aligning or speaking to SASB, and only 47 speak to the TCFD recommendations. And that does not mean they have a report. So there is a major disconnect happening between what the investors need to be able to make their assessments versus what is being made public by corporates. And given these market expectations, I thought we would just take a really high-level look at what this TCFD framework is, why it's there, and what it means. And I think it'll set us up for a conversation. So basically, the TCFD framework recommends that we look at both risks and opportunities. And these risks are typically broken down into two major types. So the first are physical risks, which most of us are well aware of. So these can be event-driven, or they can be longer term in nature. They can have financial implications for organizations, such as direct damage to assets or indirect impacts to the supply chain with disruptions. But the financial performance may also be affected by changes in water availability, sourcing, quality, food security, extreme temperature changes affecting your premises, your operations, transport needs, employee safety, et cetera. So therefore, one of the first questions to ask are, what are the physical risks from climate change? And how can more frequent or severe weather events cause direct damage to assets, cause economic disruptions and or losses to the financial system as well. And this whole process is typically done through a scenario analysis. The second are transition risks. And these relate to the risks or opportunities connected to the economic transition to a lower carbon economy. These relate to things like policies, regulatory or legal changes, like the $170 carbon price that has been put into place for Canada by 2030. What are the impacts of that going to be? Will it be positive or negative for your business? What are those risks? And then we talk about technology. What role will it play in enabling this transition to a lower carbon economy? Is it something that's being taken into consideration? And then there are the opportunities for new products and new services. And how can you make your business resilient in the face of all of these changes? And of course, what are the market expectations for your business in the face of all of these changes? These are all questions that will have an impact on financials of your business over time, which fall directly within the fiduciary duty of boards of directors. And just before I pass it back, Dora, the last point is that the framework lays out 4 major disclosure areas. The first is governance, the second is strategy, the third is risk management, and the fourth is metrics and targets. So it's a framework that can take some time for an organization to be able to really understand and fully implement. It will take time to do so, but I will say that in today's market, the investor or the financial markets expectations are to start. And it's not to have it all perfect, and that, there are steps that you can take along the path, but it is definitely the direction that financial markets overall are moving. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Dora.
Okay, thanks, Milla. Lots to think about there, and I'm sure we could do a whole session on some of the pieces that you've covered. But we'll go on to it, and I've got a question then for Melissa, who sits on several boards. And maybe you can talk about our boards discussing this. Like, are we there? We heard that sometimes companies are discussing it, but not doing it. But where are boards? And are there directors on those boards with the competency to discuss this and really to tackle this issue? So your experience and your suggestions on that, Melissa.
Thanks, Dora. And thank you, Milla, because laying it all out makes it so much clearer and somewhat terrifying. Like any major strategic issue that's come to companies, whether at the board or management level, it's always a question of readiness versus commitment. And the readiness goes to knowledge and understanding and a sense that this is important to all our stakeholders. The commitment part of that grid is really how are we able to meet the resource requirement, and again, that comes down not only to the bottom line, but the knowledge and competencies and capabilities. And across the variety of boards that I've had the privilege of serving upon, that readiness commitment grid is very different. At some point, where we all have had to, back in the day, get much better comfort and understanding and competency around financial risk. If we all remember back, post Enron, and I think what we're seeing now is a real understanding that the same sort of development of understanding, competency, skill set is being required. Having said that, we all know, nose in, fingers out, the board is not going to be managing those risks, but needs, as always, to have the core understanding to ask the right questions. And not getting ahead of our conversation, but just the viewpoint from stakeholders. Yes, there's all sorts of financial disclosure that is making its way into this conversation, but from my own shareholder engagement efforts, this is top of mind at the institutional right down to the retail. And so when we think about it, what is our response to all our stakeholders, boards do have to start going up that learning curve and going beyond a sense of, oh, it's overwhelming, to I've got to comply, to I really have to help my organization become not only competent, but maybe an advocate of some of the change. So I guess the short answer is we're all learning as we're doing.
So I have a follow-up question, really specifically. So does this mean that boards have to start looking for a director with climate change competency? Is that part of our matrix when we go out in succession planning, or is this something every board member, every director has to have?
Well, I think every director has to come with, as you know, financial and operational and every other aspect has to come with a general understanding. But I am seeing in the board recruitment efforts and the skills matrix that ESG, understanding competency skill set, is finding its place. How do you define that? Because each of those, E, S, and G, have very different expectations. But there's no question that the demand for understanding and therefore increased skill is pushing us towards looking for additional skills around the board table that we did not necessarily identify as explicitly, say, you know, even 5 years ago.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to pick up on some of the things that you said, and one of it is around the risks, which builds into the fiduciary duty that directors have. So what can directors do to meet that fiduciary duty, Milla?
Well, I mean, there's lots of things, but I think Melissa even hit on the first one, which is, I think, you know, from a board perspective, what's really important is to demonstrate that you took the necessary steps to understand the issue at hand. So even if at the end of the day, you don't adjust or adapt your course of business, but what you need to do as a board is you have to ensure the minimum that you took the time to assess the issue. And I would say, you know, to Melissa's point, education of your board is really important. These are big, broad issues. You know, ESG seems to have come out of nowhere for many people. There's a lot of misconceptions, et cetera. There's a lot of confusion. So we find that is really helpful. Boards also need to know what their financially material ESG issues are. And the reason I mention that is because many of these issues are interconnected with climate change. It's, you know, it's social acceptability, Indigenous relations. I mean, there's so many elements to the climate change conversation that you do need to know what are those issues so that you can focus on the right issues and ensure that you're communicating appropriately to the market. Specifically on climate change, I think, you know, a board has a responsibility to understand and prepare a strategy to remain profitable, relevant, resilient in the face of expected impacts. And climate change is fairly well known today. And, you know, as global economies begin to transition to this lower carbon economy, there are possible implications for your business. And it is the board's role to ask and to have clarity on what those implications could be. One of the key ways to do that is by doing something called the scenario analysis. And this is where an organization would look at various scenarios of temperatures rising, like 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and 4 degrees. And using scenarios of things like the International Energy Agency or the International Protocol for Climate Change. There's numerous scenarios. And you would take those and you would question what are the physical risks that we could confront as a business, and what are the regulatory risks, what are some of those elements I mentioned earlier. And I would just, you know, to Melissa's point, it's not that the board needs to do this work, but the work needs to be done for the board, and it needs to be reported back to the board. And I mean, what we are seeing is around this particular topic, we are seeing that there's a lot of, we do the ESG work And then we complement that with the climate work, and it ends up going into strategy sessions. And I think, where it may have been just corporate strategy, I think this is really becoming a management and a board strategy session is kind of a best practice of what we're seeing right now. And I think, out of all of this, the last point that I mentioned on the TCFD was with respect to setting targets. And that is something that we're seeing a lot of targets being put into this market. And there's an accountability to those targets, and it falls to the board, not to the management team. So the investor community really is looking for, what is this board thinking? Where will it be in 10 and 20 years? Because we know most of those management teams will not be there in 10 years, let alone 20 years. So, these are a number of the ways that boards are, in my view, are impacted or the duty that they have.
Thanks, Milla. Some good suggestions there, because that's, I think, what we're looking for here that's big. So where are some things that we can get our hands on? Melissa, maybe you can give some practical examples from your experience of how a board or something that's come up, or some of the issues and how you've tackled them.
Yeah, absolutely. And just referencing that last slide where Milla laid it out so beautifully, some of these things are very operational. So, the fundamental concerns about hardening your assets, making sure that in some of the industries in which I'm working, those are significant assets, and managing that asset base against the challenges, the physical challenges of climate change, have become a higher and higher priority, just in terms of operational investments, and making sure that, again, to Milla's point, is part of the not only the strategy writ large, but every year when we're looking at the quality of the operation, are we investing appropriately to risk against the assets that we didn't have before? Then we go into some of the governance issues raised, and yes, introducing very specific metrics into executive compensation, ranging from at a very early stage of saying within the next period of time, a complete review, a materiality assessment is going to be required to bring back to the board an understanding of where our highest risks are for feeding into the strategic conversations, and right down to some very specific targets on whether it's, again, asset-based issues or some of the governance issues, such as the diversity challenges. And so you need to use the tools at hand, and clearly executive compensation is one of the tools we have at our disposal. The overall operational planning and making sure that annual and 3-5 year business plans recognize the investments and the company is equipped to make those investments are also part of that. And then from a disclosure perspective, there's no question that what has entered into the process is the conversation with shareholders, with the agencies who advise shareholders, with other stakeholders, communities, to make very explicit what the plan forward is, and to control the narrative across those stakeholder groups. A lot of this is management's responsibility, but we at the board level absolutely own the narrative with respect to the broader understanding of the stakeholders.
So I'm going to just push forward on that stakeholder issue. We've heard about the shareholders and the financial end. I imagine some of these stakeholders aren't. Anyway, just go further on. Who do you mean by stakeholders? Who are some of those key stakeholders?
Well, there's no question the communities in which our businesses are operating, and whether it's licensed to operate literally or social license to operate, that has been and will always be a requirement to really understand that stakeholder group. Our employees, when we think about the changing demographics of the employees, we're seeing that millennials and younger, I can't remember what they're called now, Gen Z, are demanding a very clear understanding of how that company's values and activities uphold what are becoming table stakes when we go out to recruit the best and the brightest or retain those. If we are working through various Indigenous communities, I happen to work one of the organizations in a resource environment. That is a stakeholder group that has obvious influence, and not just from a communications perspective, but from a partnership perspective, is an incredibly important voice to hear. Regulators. I happen to work in industries that are highly regulated, and it's not just good enough to say I'm focusing on my shareholders. Regulators can fundamentally change the effects of the business to survive. I could go on, but that gives you a bit of a sense of the various voices we have to listen to.
Yeah, so it sort of brings to mind that we do these stakeholder mapping, and really one should be done just around this issue to make sure that you're addressing all of them.
Hugely valuable. If that has not been done at a board level, the 1-2 punch is the materiality assessment and the stakeholder analysis, from my experience. If you're just starting out, those are the places that you have to put the energy and the focus.
And Dora, if I can complement that just by saying, when from our perspective, what we talk about are the financial stakeholders. And so, yes, we talked about the investors, but beyond the investors, they're your banks, because the banks are under pressure themselves. Most of them are public organizations who have to disclose and make these commitments as well. There is also your insurance companies who equally are feeling, so there's a price, there's an influence here on your pricing of premiums or whether you will even get insurance. Then there's the credit rating agencies for your bonds. But a key point I would like to make in this, and Melissa, you're right, there are many stakeholders, but the discussion that you want to have with your financial stakeholders is very different from the conversation that you are going to have with the employees and the communities. And so the conversation and the dialogue and how you prepare yourselves for those financial stakeholders is very, very different. And that's where it comes back to some of these frameworks I talked about for SASB and TCFD. You have to be very strategic in having two types of conversations going on, broader stakeholders and financial stakeholders, because of that access to capital and what the impact is going to be on your financials over time.
Okay, there's a lot there again. So I'm going to move sort of tangent a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit about the transition. So, there's, I think, an assumption that for some industries, for some companies, it's easier to transition, and we think of others. So how do different companies and industries start thinking about that? How is it going to be financed? Who's responsible for it? And how is that happening? Milla, I'll start with you this time.
Sure. Well, those are big questions, obviously. And, different sectors are definitely going to be hit differently. And we're already seeing that in Canada very clearly. The energy sector in Canada is already being challenged from a movement to net zero emissions by 2050. This is leading to a divestment from the sector, but it's also leading to a lot of capital moving out of Canada, which impacts the whole Canadian economy. If we're not having that foreign capital flowing in to support all of our sectors. And that is happening. We know that is happening. There's a bit of a bruise on Canada, not just because of the energy sector, but because it's only 2% of a global index. But specifically to the energy sector, there's also leadership happening in this sector to try to find smart ways to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from the production of energy. There are technologies that are being anticipated, like hydrogen production, which Canada actually could be a global leader if we get this right. So it depends on the technology, et cetera. But there are lots of questions about what the impacts will be over the next 10 years for this particular sector. And we've seen it, fairly crushed given the COVID pandemic plus this overlay of climate. On the opposite side, we have the mining sector, which is being viewed from a much more positive angle, because as we move towards this transition to a lower carbon economy, there's a push for electric vehicles. We're trying to find ways to reduce our emissions, which means there's a need for copper and many of these rare earth minerals for batteries and other technologies. So here are just two examples that can be influenced in very different ways. And obviously every one will be impacted in a different fashion. So the question really becomes, how can the business prepare for it? And, I think, the question of who's responsible, well, I think it will definitely be a public and a private effort. There will be a need for global or government investments and initiatives, because in the early phases of this, there may be initiatives that just aren't financially viable, but we need it to happen in order to move the whole economy. And that's part of the role that the Canadian Infrastructure Bank is playing right now. By financing partners who have projects that may take longer to be able to demonstrate their profitability. So it's not just handouts, but it's partnerships. In other cases, we're going to need infrastructure investments. They're going to be big, so we are going to need private capital, and we need other investors to come into this. So that's where some of these big pension funds really come into play, is as we develop that out. And we're going to see things like the announcement yesterday by the federal government of a green bond, $5 billion green bond. That is the federal government's some of their mechanisms to have this financing, so that these funds do go into transitioning. And corporates will have the same opportunity. Back to Melissa's point, if you're able to demonstrate what they are, if you're able to demonstrate to your financial stakeholders what some of these KPIs are, then there are new financial vehicles being made available, like sustainability-linked bonds and sustainability-linked loans and green bonds. And these are there's going to be transition instruments in Canada. So there's all kinds of opportunity to capitalize on this, but you have to do the work. And that's the key, is the financial community is not going to give the business the financing unless you're able to demonstrate that you have a plan. And so, the financing will have to come from public and private. There's no doubt in my mind.
Melissa, just to follow up on that, and maybe speaking a little bit about the transparency issue then, on the part of boards as they change their practices. Can you speak a bit more about that?
Well, I'll echo a bit of what Milla just talked about. There's the what, and then there's the how. And the what goes right into what are the risks the company is facing? What are the strategies they're going to put into place? What are the metrics and KPIs we're going to insist at? What are the targets that we're going to insist that the organization has to reach? That's the what. That, I think we've all come to understand the why. It's an existential threat, and I don't know that there are any bodies, well, I'm editing myself. There might be people who are still denying the why, but I would like to think that we've gotten past questioning the why. We have to understand what we have to do, and then we have to figure out how to do it. Part of it is financing, and I think partnerships, public-private partnerships, because we're going to have a lot of new legislation to deal with. And there's a consequence to that in terms of how do governments help business transition from one version of their reality to the next. Through that process, I do believe that the communication to all of stakeholders is at the heart of our success, that we are very explicit about what we see as not only the risk, but the opportunity to the organization, and how we are planning and plotting our route to that successful outcome needs to be very well understood. One of the challenges with the disclosure alphabet soup that we're living in right now is it does muddy the water of disclosure. And the sooner we get to, from a financial perspective, a smaller set, if IFRS has its way, some version that everyone is using the same metrics to understand and document, and for investors and other stakeholders to monitor. Our challenge is to be really explicit about what's important to this organization and make sure the people who need to understand it, whether it's financial or other stakeholders, are getting the information in a very transparent and easy to understand way. When we think about things like the Management Information Circular, we've been told over the last 10 or 15 years, speak in plain language. Give the readers an ability to understand from their perspective what this company is trying to do. Apply the same principles to all of these disclosures around actions an organization is taking to either manage the risk or seize the opportunities through that same, speak to me like I'm a 4-year-old and help me understand. I think transparency and clarity is really important.
So I'm going to pick up on that question around opportunities because we do have to balance it. But before we go, if people want to ask questions, please put them in the chat. We'll have Melissa and Milla speak to the question about what opportunities exist, and then we'll open it up to you. Melissa, or both of you, whoever wants to go first.
Okay, I'll jump in, Milla. I think I'm going to echo a bit of what Milla said. It's industry specific, and you need to look clearly, like companies and boards do, what is the landscape that we're dealing with? What is the legislative and business and competitive landscape? In there, I see that the need for new ways to respond to business challenges always present opportunity. So electric vehicles. I mean, when you think about that as one tiny piece of the overall direction we're taking with the commitments companies are making to go carbon neutral and the way in which governments are supporting going to carbon neutrality, anyone who can do anything to support the EV universe is probably seeing a wonderful opportunity, whether it's in the manufacturer, the supply, the whole infrastructure around that. We have to start looking, in my opinion, at this as one more business challenge the same way we look at others. And I don't want to minimize the consequences of not dealing with it, because those are clearly beyond anything that we might have dealt with prior, but there are opportunities. So what scans of industry and competitive opportunities can any organization create to respond positively and to not just quite bluntly respond from fear, but respond from opportunity?
Milla?
Yeah, I agree completely with everything Melissa's offered there. And I think, first and foremost, there's an opportunity to just look at your own business practices and try to understand where could we mitigate ourselves, look through your supply chains, it's really about doing your own carbon footprinting and really understanding that position and then what you can change. So that's operationally. The other point I would make, I think, is we're on the cusp. I mean, Mark Carney calls this the fourth industrial revolution. We are on the cusp of a major, major shift. And with shifts, there are opportunities, but there's going to be competition. And we see that already, like some of the new products that are hitting the market. And I mean, I find it enthralling, to be quite honest, as I look out to see what is possible over the next 10 and 20 years. And I think that the money is going to be there. I think there's going to be lots of will to do this. So we can look at this from, oh no, regulations are changing. Oh no, this is going to be really challenging or whatever. Or you can really look at it from the other side of this coin, which is, there are major changes in your competitive landscape. And in there lies lots of opportunities for growth. And I think that's where I would really highlight that, the opportunity. I don't think it's an either or. I think it's both. I think you have to manage your current business and make sure that you're positioning it properly and making, as you do these scenario analysis and you start to look out at a 4-degree world, all of a sudden, some of the assets that you have may not look so viable. And you may want to sell those well in advance of somebody else figuring out that they're not going to be so viable, because we don't want to end up with stranded assets. And so, there's tons of opportunities. So, for me, the first step of all of this is you just take small steps, but you've got to move forward, because if you don't, you're going to be left behind. I think that's becoming incredibly clear to me as organizations. But there's lots to do. And I think in that lots to do, you can try to find places where you can distinguish yourselves as a business. So I think that's where I see the opportunity.
Okay, we've got a few minutes for questions. I've got one here from Carl, and he says, in a 4-degree world, there's not much that survives.
Agreed, Cadell. And that's the whole point of doing these scenarios is, no one wants us to be at a 4-degree world. The IPCC suggests 1.5 is maximum. But we're not on the trajectory for 1.5. We're on a trajectory for 2 or +2. So that's where we do have to be anticipating that there are these potential changes coming. Again, physical transition, and that's the role of a board of directors, is to be thinking about these elements and asking and setting strategy.
I'm open to questions. If there is none, I have something else that I think that, what about some of the people on this call, I'm sure, are governance professionals, and that they're not actually sitting on a board, but they may be a corporate secretary or feeding up into the board. And so what do you do? How do you prompt this conversation with your directors if they're not open to it yet?
Well, every corporate secretary I work with has incredible influence over everything from the board agenda to how much time we get to talk about everything. So use that influence to make sure that the right agendas are being developed, and as something as simple as enough time on an agenda to have a fulsome conversation. If we get back to the world where we meet in person, one of the best ways to have an initial conversation perhaps is the board dinner that happens during, before, or after. In addition to that, I think corporate secretaries are also managing the follow-on and making sure that actions or questions that have been raised through the meetings don't disappear, that they are tracked and fed back to management appropriately and close the loop back to the board. So I think there's an incredible amount of support that we get as board members from our corporate secretariat. And this is the way in which I would ask them to keep feeding and managing the board agendas to focus on the right things.
And on my end, Dora, my experience has been that, many of our corporate clients approach us from the corporate secretary. It's, on behalf of the board, we need to do something. And, well, whether it's, as I mentioned, just the beginning of education, let's start with that. And, or we need to understand these disclosure requirements, or what are the ESG issues, whatever. Many of those calls come from corporate secretaries. And of course, they sit in a very privileged position between the board and the management as well. And so, it's a very influential role, who can really, and they know the members of those two teams, and are able to, to maneuver that along at the pace and the speed that's needed. So anyway, yeah, just, that for us, that's often where we get asked to come in and help, is actually through the corporate secretaries, and we work really closely with them.
Okay. Are there any questions?
I see William Fung has Dora has hand up.
Okay, William. Oh, there.
Hello, good morning. Yeah, I just wish to ask the panelists a question. From what I understand, of course, the Chartered Governance Institute are from countries where the Anglo-Saxon mode of corporate governance, namely based on shareholder primacy. Usually, that's where that's where we all come from. However, from my understanding, due to different historical background of the economic development, continental Europe as well as Japan and some other countries, they have a different approach to corporate governance, which they call the stakeholder approach, where it's not unusual for boards to have representatives from the government, the creditors like the banks, the unions, etc., to have a seat, and thereby they can bring more diverse opinions to the board. So because all this ESG is coming up, do you see that the Anglo-Saxon way is morphing a little bit towards the stakeholder version? And second question is, do you think, do you see, or do you think that their version may be producing better efforts in meeting the ESG challenge? Thank you.
I'll take a whack at that, William. Very interesting question. So Milton Friedman is no longer the voice supreme, even in the traditional Anglo-Saxon governance world. The reality is many of the practices that we see, as you described in Europe, with many more stakeholders having not only influence but actual power within the governance sector, is evolving into at least Canadian governance models in a very direct way. When I spoke earlier about which voices do you listen to, there's one of the best ways to make sure a voice representative of a particular stakeholder group is listened to is to find a way to include these voices on our boards. Many of the boards in which I'm operating actually are setting targets for themselves about increasing the number of representatives from those stakeholder groups. Historically, talk about crown corporations in Canada, that's always been about full representation, but I think the for-profit, private, publicly traded world is also opening more and more to having a much more multifaceted and diverse, not only diverse in superficial ways, but in deep lived experience. I think we're moving in a direction that's much more open to hearing multiple voices than we've had before.
Milla, is there something from your experience or knowledge of what's happening in overseas? Are they tackling the issues?
Well, we definitely, I mean, when we're doing our corporate work, we're always speaking to investors. So, even there, we see the voice of those various stakeholders having an increasing voice, shall I say. I think, in North America, in particular in Canada, because of the BCE ruling of a number of years ago, it has been enshrined in Canadian law that it is the shareholder and the stakeholders, but that's not the case south of the border. in the US. So, obviously it varies. I think Canada is probably moving closer to the European model because of that. But we definitely see the difference as the voices, as the investors are doing their assessments out of Europe, they are certainly taking into consideration all of those stakeholders. So I think that's about all I can add at this point.
Okay, great. Is there another question? I think we've got time for one more.
I may have one.
Okay.
Is it too late? No.
No.
So obviously, Milla, we've been working together. So there's a lot I know already, and a lot I'm going to learn from you in the coming weeks. But my question is really this. I used to work in the environmental sector, so like the science on climate was very clear to everyone. And I'm very excited to see that like we're actually developing the tools, the governance, the financial tools to make a market economy work within a 1.5 degrees limit. I mean, that's just a great innovation, but I'm wondering how best, and we've answered, like I'm kind of asking a question that was asked from different angles, so I'm trying a different angle this time. It's like, how can we move from a situation where, how can we move quickly from a situation where rigorous management of assets and rigorous board oversight, it doesn't include all of this, climate science and climate context, and shift very quickly to one where, like, are there any is there a leapfrog possibility? Is there something we can do that can actually trigger change? Because otherwise, it takes time to change, to educate people and then to start changing processes and ways of doing things. You know what I mean? It's like, it takes time, and we don't have that much time. So I'm wondering.
Well, I think it has been taking time. I personally think that things are evolving very, very quickly. And I think, south of the border, in the US, I think we're going to see that they are going to take leadership on this topic and will force it. So I think regulations will be a big part of that, Karel. But I would also say, what we're seeing from the investor side is this push towards a say on climate. So, it used to be say on pay for executive compensation. We've seen that started to come here as we go into the proxy season, et cetera. It didn't take a big hold, but I suspect it probably will next year. And so I think it's my perspective. I think there are multiple things that are happening all at the same time that I actually see the speed amplifying to the point where I question if do we have the right guardrails? I kind of fear that we may move so fast that we end up with some blow-ups around this topic. So yeah, I consider it with cautious optimism about how fast, but I think we need to just ensure that there are some of these guardrails as we go along. And I think that's where the regulators come in. I don't know, Melissa, if you have anything else to add to that.
Well, I think the leapfrog will be capital driven, and follow the money. And what we're seeing now, and what I personally have experienced is what I mentioned earlier in any kind of shareholder engagement that I've been involved in on behalf of my boards. The investors are demanding evidence of action being taken, and they will withhold capital. The regulators will put the guardrails up. If we are going to leapfrog, it's because the sources of capital are making it a requisite action, and that includes all of the ISS and Glass Lewis, the advisors who have undue influence sometimes, but who are basically saying those guys are worth putting your capital, those guys aren't, through the lens of ESG writ large, but very specifically climate change. So I think the money will make the difference.
So we have reached our time, and I want to thank very much both our panelists, Milla and Melissa. There's a lot of information here. I think people know how to get in touch with you should they have follow-up questions. And I want to thank everybody who attended on behalf of the Quebec chapter of the Chartered Governance Institute, and the collaboration that we've had and been able to, I think, start with COVID, actually, these online sessions and the working with the Chartered Governance Institute of Canada. So thanks very much.